So in this video, I'll be discussing The Martian, the book, not the movie. And so, quick spoiler-free review. This is a really amazing, sci-fi book. It's not too heavy sci-fi, as in, I think it's probably set, 20, 30 years in the future, and nothing, no crazy technology or anything, but it's definitely science fiction, and it's maybe a good introduction to science fiction for people like me who are not really into, big overarching, Asimov-style sci-fi, but I still enjoy the idea of, stuff being set in the future and exploring, near-future problems that to me are a bit more relatable. Yeah, it was a really good sci-fi book. It's very funny, surprisingly. I didn't expect it to be that funny, but it is very funny. Some bits of it almost read like a bit of a comedy. And yeah, just a really good, interesting read. And I'm also told, I forget who told me this, but don't quote me on this, but I think that the science in it is relatively accurate, other than the very start of the book. Other than that, though, I'm told the science is relatively accurate. So that's also interesting if you're looking for something a bit more realistic. So yeah, this is like a realistic, well-written, funny, easy to relate to sci-fi book. So yeah, that's the spoiler free. So for spoilers, this book is really well paced. It kept me engaged from the very start. I was sort of and I don't normally get gripped too much by books. I'm normally pretty good at being able to put a book down, but this book I just had to keep reading, particularly as I got to the end. So the start of this book is really quite cool the way, and I'm told this is the non-scientifically accurate part of the book where there's like a dust storm and they have to evacuate and stuff, but it's really cool and it starts well and it starts with some action, but not ridiculous action that it really sets up the rest of the book, but you still start with that, action, and then, so yeah, the start of the book's really good. The premise is really awesome. I mean, let's just take a second to talk about the premise. Yeah, the idea of somebody being stuck on Mars and having to deal with it and stuff is really, really cool, and I really enjoy that, and I really enjoy the way it was executed. And I reckon a big part of the way it was executed is, so let's talk about now the structure, or sort of the format of this book. So this book's sort of presented in sort of three different ways. So you see, the majority of it is presented from Mark Watney, the main character, his diary. He writes a diary every day or every few days or whatever, and you kind of see what, and he says what he's been doing and stuff. So that's most of a book. I mean, sort of the second most of a book is that every now and again you go to Earth and you see NASA's perspective and various significant people on Earth's perspective of what's happening. Them trying to figure out, for example, you get to see them figure out that he's alive and stuff. And then the third perspective that you get very rarely is this sort of third person, godlike perspective, where it's talking about, so the objective things that we need to describe happening to Mark, and we want to describe why it's happening. We get a sort of omniscient perspective. So for example, it describes how the seams frayed on his habitable unit for ages, and that led to the decompression and stuff. And so I really think that this structure worked really well, because I like this idea of this diary, and it's Mark presenting stuff that happened to him over the day, and we get to see his perspective and stuff, and I'll get into that when I talk about character, but that's a really good format. But the problem is that when you're trying to go for something with suspense, it would sort of undercut the suspense if, he survived because he's recording that diary, so he's fine and still has a computer and stuff if he's recording the diary that night. So that's where that last perspective I told you about comes in really handy, where it's this perspective of an omniscient god, so we don't need to have Mark's diary to see the dramatic events unfolding. So whenever these real big dramatic events happen, he gets this hab decompression, his hab explodes, we get this really cool perspective, omniscient perspective, which provides us still that suspense, and then we cut back to Mark's diary later and he talks about the events, and so we sort of get this double, we get the objective perspective of what happened, and then we get Mark's diary perspective of what happened as well. And then I think that another thing that really helped is we get, the author's not afraid to use that third perspective of people on Earth. Also, I should say that it's not just people on Earth, it's also people, his fellow astronauts on his spaceship. And that's also a really good perspective, and that really helps us sort of understand what society is thinking about what's happening, and why, and it gives us sort of some context for what NASA's doing, or what they're trying to do, and what they're trying to do to help Mark and stuff. And so it just really gives sort of an extra dimension to this book. So this book, again, in my opinion, it gets all the benefit of that diary style, with none of the real negatives, because whenever there would be a negative, the author's not afraid to just be well, screw it, I'm back to being a normal book, I'm just going to tell you about people now. And I really enjoy that. So that was really good. And it sort of leads me into, I was talking about the benefits of a diary style, and I think that the main one is character. So Mark, as the main character, is basically, if you were to graph it, 95% of his book is Mark, and 5% is every other character. And that's fine, because he just pops off the page. His personality is so, I feel like I know this guy. I feel like I'd happily go out for a drink with this dude and just have a chat with him, and, because he feels so real and so well realized. And a big part of that is his sort of, is this sort of attitude. Whenever something bad happens, he's always joking about it, and and you could tell, and his emotions really bleed through the page. You really, you really hear him, like, like, for example, his have decompressed, he's like, well, shit, and he's like talking about it, and he's always cracking jokes and being funny. And this book just sort of, like, Mark is just a funny dude. Like, there's this one scene I really enjoyed where this dude on Earth is, he's thinking to himself, yeah, Mark's been on, like, Mars for, like, 150 days, I wonder what he's thinking about. And then it just cuts to Mark's diary for that day, and it's talking about how, like, Aquaman controlling whales or whatever. And that might seem a bit silly, but it actually really works in the context of this book, because you can just see that Mark he's serious, he's an astronaut, he's doing intelligent stuff, but he's not afraid to have a bit of fun and, like, joke about and stuff. That really comes through for his diary, and we also come through for his communications with Earth and stuff, where he's just, like, typing up boobies and stuff to annoy them. And and that might sound a bit more immature when I'm presenting it without the context, but I show you that with the context, it really paints him as sort of a fun, like, enjoyable, like, cool dude. And another thing I really enjoy is his perseverance, because the author's not afraid to throw, like, problems at him, right? But he always, like, solves them in in a succinct, like, project-based way. He's always, like, thinking, like, this is what I need to do, and he's always working towards stuff. And it really does sort of fill you as, like, as a reader with that, like, sort of feeling. It's like, oh yeah, I really like this guy because he's working, like, he has a goal and he's really working towards it. And I think that really benefits it, because the structure of this book is extremely simple when you think about it. It's dude trapped on Mars, needs to live until he can get home somehow, right? It's super simple, but what it means is it really gives you the sense of progress and sense of, particularly once we get a deadline, to about halfway through a book, we get a deadline of when we know he's going to leave, and so it really gives us a sense of progress, because we can literally count down the days, because each diary entry starts with, day 400 and blah, 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 and so we can really count down the days until this deadline is met. And so it really gives this book the sense of progress, and it gives this character a sense of progress, because we know where it's ending, and he knows where it's ending. Because sometimes when you read a book, I, like, for example, say I read the Lord of the Rings book, but I'd also seen the movie, so I knew when this book was ending, right? But the characters inside didn't know, and so whereas in this book, the characters know when it's ending, you know when it's ending, and so it really means that you sort of, like, relate to and understand what the character's thinking. And that brings me to the next point I want to talk about, which is the end of this book. And the end of this book is sort of mainly told through that sort of objective perspective I was telling you about, and also the perspective of the astronauts on board Mark's ship, with a little bit of Mark as well. And the end of his book is just so strong. I literally was getting, like, stressed because he's launching off Mars to meet their ship, and I was like, oh god, I hope it works, even though I know it works, because I've actually seen the movie, although I did see it a long time ago, when it came out. But, like, what I'm saying is that, like, I was real stressed, and so that just shows how well the author built up tension, even though I knew the outcome. And so it was just a really well done end scene. Lots of, like, once again, the author's not afraid to throw some challenges at them, which they solve. And that's the other thing, this book's never needlessly depressing or anything. Like, things go wrong, things go very wrong, but because of the way the characters handle it, mainly Mark, but obviously towards the end also his crewmates, it's sort of like really well handled. You don't feel depressed, but you do feel like there's challenges, and so this entire book sort of feels like those exercise bikes, and you ride on the exercise bike, and it's got, like, alternating terrain. It goes up and up and up, and it keeps getting steeper, and you keep going higher, and you've gained altitude and vary. This book really feels like that, where he's, like, peaks and valleys, but he's always going to, and the book ends obviously with him being rescued and being on the ship. I did expect there to be a little bit of stuff on Earth when he got back, but actually the author was just like, no, he's back on the ship, and that's done. And I thought I respected that decision. I would have maybe liked to have seen a little bit of stuff of him, getting back to Earth, but I don't think that's the story the author wanted to tell. The author wanted to tell the story of him being on Mars and him getting rescued, and that was the whole story, and that's fine. And so, he ended it concisely, and then sort of in the way and with a bit of comedy as well, because he gets on a ship, but then no one wants to be near him because he stinks real bad because he hasn't washed in, like, 400 days or something. So a little bit of comedy at the end there as well. So yeah, honestly, overall, I really, really like this book. And like I said, I don't really read sci-fi. I can't remember the last sci-fi book I read. But this one, honestly, for me, was really good, like, soft sci-fi, good characters, really interesting. And these ideas that are explored in the book, for example, like, this idea is sort of touched upon a little bit, where it's like, is it worth spending, hundreds of millions of dollars to save this guy? And it also touches on a bit at the end, where it's like, well, the idea is that it's not necessarily the guy, it's the idea of the dude being saved, the idea of space travel and humans, looking forward and helping each other and stuff. And so I really enjoyed, there were some themes that were tackled throughout this book, mainly that idea of, helping a fellow person, compassion, and what compassion is worth, compassion for one person versus compassion for, these hundreds of millions of dollars. You could presumably do a lot of good with that. And so that idea is explored and touched on a little bit, although not very deeply. But once again, I feel like I really have to, like, sort of, default to what the author was intending here, because the author was obviously trying to tell quite a contained sci-fi story. And that's one more thing I'd like to touch on just before I finish up this video, is that the science in here is, I'm a relatively scientifically literate person. I've got a minor in a science subject, but not a major. So I'm sort of, like I sort of know some science, and I don't know a lot of science, and I know some of the terms, I don't know some of the terms, that sort of like level of understanding. And so this book was quite good for that, I reckon, for that sort of level, because I understood some of the stuff he was talking about. He's talking about oxygenators and sublimating, and I'm like, oh yeah, I know what that word meant. I feel like I picked it up in year 10 sometime, that sort of thing. And some of the stuff went over my head, but I'd say I think I understood about 80% of what the sort of science that Mark Watney's talking about. And I think that's a really good ratio, because most of the stuff you understand, and it's obviously it's also quite Googleable. So if you're reading this, and you're like, I didn't quite get that. Like I did this a couple of times. You just Google it, and you're like, oh, that's what's happening. And so the science is sort of at that level where you kind of feel engaged, because you're like, oh yeah, I kind of just basically get this. Oh, that's what he's talking about. Oh, maybe I'll just quickly Google this. And so you feel like kind of engaged, and it's challenging you a little bit. But it's not so like ridiculous. He's not talking. And sometimes like when the science is hard for him, he just sort of like, and when I say him, I mean Mark Watney, the main character. He just sort of expresses it back to you as like a succinct thing. For example, at one point he's talking about this formula. He's like, I put it into this beefy formula. So the author kind of has this understanding of how he expects you to understand a little bit of stuff, and he doesn't mince words. He won't like give you translations of every word, but some of the more scientific jargony stuff he will try and either simplify for you or translate for you. And it really gives us this idea where I felt like throughout the book I was being challenged to understand things. And occasionally I would read a paragraph twice just to feel like I understood it correctly, but I wasn't like getting bamboozled. It wasn't like I had no idea what was going on. I was like totally confused or anything. So yeah, there's a really nice balance struck with the science where I felt like I was challenged and was reading something a little bit, that I had to pay attention to, but not ridiculous that I had to go over it like 1,000 times or anything. Or have a physics PhD. So yeah, overall, just to sort of summarize all of this, this book has a really cool structure, really good pacing, good tension, fantastic characters. It's a really good intro sci-fi story. I say characters, I mean character. Explores a couple of themes, touches on them a little bit, and you could go a bit further if you want to. Has really interesting science, and yeah, it's just really really cool. Oh, just one thing to touch on at the end there is also it's an interesting little introduction to like Mars and like Mars like geography and stuff, where it talks about different parts of Mars and like craters and stuff. So if that's something that interests you, just sort of understanding how other planets look and feel, he sort of has this really good way of, the author Andy Weir, I think, has this really good way of just sort of projecting and Mars into your mind, and sort of making you visualize it and stuff. So yeah, just really good. Really, really enjoyed this book. And I wish there was a sequel, but I don't think there is. So yeah, thanks very much for watching, and have a great day.